Have you ever held a photograph in your hands and felt the entire world it represented turn to ash? I have. It wasn't an old, faded picture from a forgotten album. It was a new one, glossy and bright, taken just last summer. A picture of my husband, Robert, and our son, Leo. They were standing on the dock by the lake, arms around each other, beaming with a pride that I, for a fleeting moment, thought I shared. They were celebrating. I only found out later what that celebration was for. It was for the sale of my life's work. It was for the signature on a piece of paper that effectively erased 25 years of my existence. That photograph wasn't a memory of a happy day. It was evidence of the day my family decided I was no longer a part of the future we were supposed to build together. It was the day they sold our company from under me, and in doing so, sold a piece of my soul. My story doesn't begin with that betrayal, though. It begins with the scent of freshly cut pine and the hum of a table saw in a cold, dusty garage. It begins in a modest little house in a quiet suburban neighborhood in Ontario, where the maple trees would turn the most brilliant shade of red every autumn. My name is Beatrice Young, and for the longest time, I believed I was the luckiest woman in the world. Robert and I were high school sweethearts. He was the dreamer, the one with sawdust in his hair and grand visions sketched onto napkins. I was the practical one, the one who saw the numbers, the one who knew how to turn his beautiful, chaotic dreams into a tangible plan. We married young, filled with that impossible, brilliant confidence that only youth can afford. Our son, Leo, arrived a few years later, and our small world felt complete. Robert was working for a large construction firm back then, but his heart wasn't in it. He'd come home smelling of drywall and disappointment, his creative spirit stifled by corporate uniformity. He wanted to build things that lasted. He wanted to create furniture, cabinets, pieces of art that families would gather around for generations. Things with heart, he would say, his eyes shining with a familiar fire. Things that tell a story. And so, Young & Son's Fine Cabinetry was born. The son part was aspirational at the time, a promise to a future where little Leo, then just 5 years old, would one day stand beside his father. We started in our garage. We poured every penny of our savings into it. I remember the day the first real piece of machinery was delivered, a second-hand lathe that took up almost the entire space. We stood there, hand in hand, just looking at it, this hulking, greasy piece of metal that represented so much hope and so much risk. I left my part-time bookkeeping job to manage our fledgling business full-time. I learned about wood grains and joinery, about invoicing and supply chains. I was the one on the phone with clients, soothing their worries, translating Robert's artistic vision into practical terms they could understand. Those early years were a blur of hardship and happiness. There were nights we ate nothing but toast and tea because a client was late on a payment. There were moments of sheer panic when a crucial tool broke down and we had no money to fix it. But there was also the profound joy of seeing our first creation, a beautiful oak dining table, delivered to a happy family. I remember crying as the truck pulled away. They weren't tears of sadness, but of overwhelming pride. We had made something real. We had built it from nothing but an idea, our 4 hands, and a shared belief. Leo grew up in that workshop. His first steps were taken on a floor sprinkled with wood shavings. His first words were mixed in with the sounds of sanding and hammering. He learned to measure from his father, and he learned to balance a ledger from me. He was the heart of it all, the reason we pushed so hard. We weren't just building a company, we were building a legacy for him. The sign above the workshop door, which we eventually moved from the garage to a proper commercial space, was a constant reminder, Young & Sons. It was a family promise, carved in wood. I handled the business. All of it. The client relationships, the payroll, the taxes, the marketing. Robert was the artist, the craftsman. He was brilliant, but he hated the paperwork. "That's your magic," he'd say, kissing my forehead as I hunched over a pile of receipts late at night. "I make the wood sing, you make the numbers work." It felt like a perfect partnership. We were 2 halves of a whole, each essential, each valued. Or so I thought. When Leo finished college, he came straight into the business, just as we'd always dreamed. He was sharp, ambitious, full of modern ideas about websites and social media marketing. I was so proud. My heart felt like it would burst. My boy, my son, working alongside his father, continuing what we had started. The three of us. The perfect trinity. For 25 years, that company was my world. It was my third child, the one I had nurtured from a fragile infancy into a strong, thriving adult. I knew the names of all our employees' children. I sent flowers when their parents were ill. I remembered our first clients' anniversaries. I wasn't just the bookkeeper. I was the soul of the place, the keeper of its history, the guardian of its heart. The company wasn't just a business that provided us a comfortable living. It was the entire story of our family. It was the long nights and the early mornings. It was the arguments over stained colors and the shared laughter over a silly mistake. It was the silent understanding that passed between Robert and me with just a glance across the workshop floor. It was everything. And I never, not for 1 second, imagined that the two people who stood at the center of that world with me would one day decide that my part in the story was over. I never imagined they would be the ones to burn the book, chapter by chapter, until all that was left for me were the ashes. The change was so subtle at first, I almost didn't notice it. It was like the slow, creeping chill of a Canadian winter. You feel it in the air long before the first snowflake falls. It started with closed doors. Robert and Leo began having meetings that I wasn't invited to. When I'd ask what they were about, the answers were always vague. Just streamlining, B, Robert would say, patting my hand dismissively. Boring supply chain logistics. You don't need to worry your head about it. Or Leo would chime in with a cool, detached tone. It's just new-gen marketing stuff, Mom. Digital projections, analytics. It would just bore you. Bore me? I was the one who had built our first client list from a rotary phone and a stack of index cards. I was the one who had taught myself accounting from library books because we couldn't afford a professional. Nothing about our business had ever bored me. It was my lifeblood. But I tried to understand. Leo was young, full of fire. Maybe he felt I was old-fashioned. Maybe Robert was just trying to give him more space to grow, to make his own mark. I told myself I was being too sensitive. I was a wife and a mother. It was my job to nurture, to step back when needed, to let my sun shine. So I stepped back. I focused on the parts of the business I was still allowed to touch, the local accounts, the community outreach, the things they deemed Beatrice's domain. The distance grew. The easy camaraderie we once shared around the dinner table was replaced by a strained silence, punctuated by talk of meetings I knew nothing about and business trips I wasn't a part of. They started dressing differently. Robert, who had lived his life in flannel shirts and work boots, was suddenly wearing tailored suits. Leo was always on his phone, speaking in a clipped, corporate language I didn't recognize. They spoke of leveraging assets and maximizing shareholder value. We were a family business. We didn't have shareholders. Our only assets were our good name, our skilled hands, and the trust we had built over 2.5 decades. I felt like a ghost in my own home, in my own life. I'd walk into the living room, and they would fall silent, a shared look passing between them. The warmth that had once filled our house had evaporated, replaced by a cold, sterile tension. I tried to talk to Robert one night. We were in the kitchen. The same kitchen with the cabinets he had built for me with his own hands as a wedding anniversary gift 20 years earlier. I touched the smooth, worn surface of the maple. Rob, I began, my voice trembling slightly. What's going on? I feel so shut out. We used to talk about everything. He wouldn't look at me. He just stared into his cup of coffee as if it held all the answers. Things are changing, B. The market is changing. We have to adapt or die. But why can't we adapt together? I pleaded. Why am I being left in the dark? This is my company too. He finally looked up, and his eyes were cold, devoid of the warmth I had known for over 30 years. You're being emotional, he said flatly. This is business now. It's complex. Just trust us. We're doing what's best for the family. Trust us. The words echoed in the silent kitchen. I had trusted him with my life, with my heart, with my future. But the man sitting across from me was a stranger. The trust one had given so freely for so long was now being used as a shield to hide a truth he didn't want me to see. The loneliness of that moment was a physical ache in my chest. I was married. I had a son. I lived in a house full of people, but I had never felt so utterly alone. The final blow came not with a bang, but with a quiet, official-looking envelope in the mail. It wasn't addressed to Mr. and Mrs. Robert Young, or even to the Young family. It was addressed solely to me, Beatrice Young. I opened it with a sense of dread. It was from a law firm I didn't recognize. The language was dense and legal, but the message was brutally clear. It was a formal notification regarding the transfer of assets of Young and Sons Fine Cabinetry to a larger, faceless corporation. The sale had been finalized the previous week. I read it 3 times, my hands shaking so violently the paper rattled. It didn't make sense. A sale? A transfer of assets? This had to be a mistake. A horrible, bureaucratic error. I walked, in a daze, from the mailbox, through the front door, and into the living room where Robert and Leo were sitting. They were watching television, a golf tournament. The normalcy of the scene was grotesque. I held up the letter. "What is this?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Leo glanced at it, then quickly looked away, his jaw tight. Robert sighed, a long, weary sound, and muted the television. He took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose, the way he always did when he was preparing to deliver bad news. Sit down," he said calmly. "I don't want to sit down, Robert," I said, my voice rising with a hysteria I couldn't control. "I want to know what this letter means." "It's what we've been working on," Leo said, finally meeting my gaze. His eyes were cold and defiant. "We got an incredible offer. It sets us up for life, Mom. All of us." "You sold the company?" The words felt foreign in my mouth. "You sold it?" "Without telling me." "We knew you'd get emotional," Robert said, his voice laced with a condescending pity that felt like a slap in the face. "We knew you wouldn't understand the opportunity. It was a business decision, Beatrice." "A smart one." "A business decision?" I choked out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. That business was my life. It was our life. 25 years of my heart and my soul are in that company. My name may not have been on the sign, Robert, but my fingerprints are on every single piece of it. "Don't be dramatic," Leo snapped. "Dad and I built that company. We were the ones in the workshop." The cruelty of his words struck me silent for a moment. I looked at my son, this boy I had rocked to sleep, whose scraped knees I had bandaged, whose dreams I had encouraged. I looked at the man he had become, and I didn't recognize him. "I was the one who found the clients," I said, my voice now dangerously quiet. "I was the one who balanced the books when we were a week away from bankruptcy. I was the one who answered the phone at 3 a.m. when a shipment was late. I was there. I was always there." Robert stood up and tried to put his arm around me. "Of course you were, B. And we appreciate it. This deal, it's for you too. You never have to worry about money again. You can relax now. You've earned a rest." I flinched away from his touch as if I'd been burned. Relax? Rest? They hadn't given me a gift. They had put me out to pasture. They had deemed my contribution complete, my purpose served. They hadn't just sold a company. They had sold our story. They had sold our past. And in that moment, standing in my own living room, looking at the 2 men I loved more than anything in the world, I realized they had also sold my future, and they had gotten a very good price for it. The photograph on the mantelpiece of them smiling by the lake caught my eye, and I finally understood what they were so happy about. They were celebrating their freedom. Freedom from the past. Freedom from me. The days that followed the discovery were a thick, suffocating fog. I moved through my own house like a stranger, the silence roaring in my ears. The man I had shared a bed with for over 30 years was now an alien presence beside me. His breathing at night, once a comforting rhythm, now sounded like a betrayal with every exhale. Leo avoided me completely. If I entered a room, he would find a reason to leave, his phone pressed to his ear as a convenient shield. The home I had so lovingly created, the one filled with furniture Robert had built and memories we had all made, had transformed into a museum of a life that was no longer mine. Each object was a painful exhibit: the hand-carved rocking chair where I'd nursed Leo, the kitchen table where we'd celebrated every birthday, the imperfections in the hardwood floor that I knew by heart. It was all tainted. I tried to understand the logistics of it. How could they do this? Legally? I spent hours in my little home office, the one they had stopped entering, pulling out old files and boxes of paperwork. And that's when I found the second, and perhaps more cutting, betrayal. It was slower, more calculated. Over the years, as the business grew and we incorporated, new legal structures were put in place. Robert, with Leo's encouragement in the later years, had handled all of it. "Just sign here, B," he would say, pointing to a line on a document thick with legal jargon. "It's just standard incorporation stuff." I had trusted him implicitly. Why wouldn't I? He was my husband, my partner. What I discovered, with the help of a lawyer I hired with what little personal savings I had, was that my name was nowhere. On the original, informal partnership agreement we drafted on a napkin all those years ago, I was an equal. But on the official corporate documents, the ones that mattered, I was listed as a non-voting corporate secretary. A title. A formality. I had no ownership stake. No legal claim. My 25 years of sweat, sacrifice, and soul had been legally rendered as a job. A job for which I was now being summarily dismissed. The realization was a cold, sharp blade twisting in my gut. This wasn't a recent decision made in a moment of temptation. This had been a slow, methodical erasure of my role, planned over years. Every time Robert had told me not to worry my head about the paperwork, he wasn't protecting me from boredom. He was protecting his and Leo's scheme. The confrontation that followed this discovery was a quiet, pathetic affair. There was no more yelling. I had no fight left in me. I laid the documents out on the dining room table. Robert looked at them and didn't even have the grace to look ashamed. "It was for tax purposes, B," he said, his voice flat and rehearsed. It was simpler this way. It made the company more attractive to a potential buyer. A potential buyer, I repeated, the words tasting like poison. "So you were planning this? For how long?" He shrugged. "You have to keep your options open in business." That was it. My life, our shared dream, had been an option. I looked at him, really looked at him, and I saw a man I had never truly known. A man who could compartmentalize love and business so completely that he could smile at me over breakfast while simultaneously plotting to cut me out of the life we had built. The love I had felt for him for decades curdled into something I couldn't name. It was heavier than hate, colder than anger. It was a profound, bottomless disappointment. The money they had promised, the money that was supposed to be my reward, began to feel like blood money. A check appeared on my nightstand one morning. A generous amount, I suppose, if you're measuring a life in dollars. It was presented as a gift, a token of appreciation for my years of service. It wasn't my share. It was a severance package. I was being paid off. I left the check sitting there for a week, unable to touch it. To accept it felt like agreeing with their assessment of my worth. My world had shrunk to the four walls of that house. My friends, many of whom I knew through the business, didn't know what to say. The news had spread through our small community. Some looked at me with pity. Others, I'm sure, whispered that Robert and Leo were smart businessmen who had finally freed themselves of the emotional dead weight. The isolation was absolute. I spent my days staring out the window at the changing leaves, the same brilliant red maples that had once filled me with so much joy, now seemed to mock me with their vibrancy. I had lost my husband. I had lost my son. I had lost my purpose. I was Beatrice Young, a 58-year-old woman with a healthy bank account and an entirely empty life. The lowest point came on a Tuesday afternoon. I was cleaning out a closet, a mindless task to pass the endless hours, when I found an old box. Inside was the very first dollar bill we ever made from a sale. We had framed it in a cheap little frame from the hardware store. Tucked behind it was a note Robert had written me, to my partner in everything. The first of many. "I love you, Rob." I sank to the floor of the closet, clutching that frame to my chest, and I wept. I wept for the young woman I had been, so full of hope and trust. I wept for the man he used to be, or the man I thought he was. I wept for the family that was now just a collection of broken pieces. I stayed there on the floor for hours, the dust motes dancing in the single sliver of light from under the door, and I finally allowed myself to feel the full, crushing weight of what I had lost. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to my bones, that I could not stay in that house a single day longer. It wasn't a home anymore. It was a tomb. Leaving was the hardest and most necessary thing I have ever done. Packing up 30 years of my life was an exercise in brutal emotional triage. What do you take with you from a shipwreck? I couldn't take the furniture Robert had made. It felt like bringing my own ghosts along for the ride. I couldn't take the family photos from the walls. They were portraits of a lie. I packed my clothes, my books, and a few small, personal treasures that predated the company, that predated the life I was now leaving behind. The last thing I packed was the small, framed dollar bill. I took it out of its frame, folded the bill carefully, and slipped Robert's note into my wallet. The dollar itself felt meaningless now, but his words, my partner in everything, were a reminder I needed to carry. A reminder of what I had believed in and what had been so thoroughly broken. I found a small apartment on the other side of town, overlooking a little park. It was tiny compared to the house, but the emptiness felt clean, not oppressive. For the first time in months, I could breathe. The first few weeks were a study in silence. I had to learn how to be alone. I had gone from being a high school girl to a wife, to a mother, to a business partner, without ever having a moment to just be Beatrice. Who is she? I had no idea. I had defined myself for so long by my relationships to other people, Robert's wife, Leo's mother, the heart of the company. With all of those titles stripped away, I was a blank slate. Slowly, tentatively, I started to fill it in. I started walking in the park every morning. I watched the seasons change, not through the window of a house full of painful memories, but out in the fresh, cold air. I bought a coffee from the same small cafe every day, and eventually, the simple act of the barista remembering my order felt like a tiny anchor in my unmoored world. I started reading again, not business journals or accounting textbooks, but novels, poetry, stories that took me far away from my own. One day, I was walking past a community center and saw a flyer on the board. A local charity that built and delivered furniture to families transitioning out of homelessness was looking for volunteers. No experience necessary, it said, just a willingness to help. My heart gave a painful lurch. Furniture. Wood. The world I had been so violently ejected from. My first instinct was to walk away, to protect myself from the pain. But something stopped me. I went in. The workshop was chaotic, noisy, and smelled wonderfully of sawdust and wood glue. It was nothing like the polished, efficient operation Young and Sons had become. It was messy, joyful, and full of people of all ages, laughing and working together. An older gentleman named Arthur, the volunteer coordinator, showed me around. He asked if I had any experience. For the first time, I didn't know what to say. Did I? My experience was in spreadsheets and phone calls, not with a chisel and saw. My husband was a cabinet maker, I said quietly, the words feeling strange and distant. I spent a lot of time in his workshop. Good enough for me, Arthur said with a warm smile. He handed me a piece of sandpaper. We've got a batch of children's beds to finish. Easiest job in the place. Just make them smooth. So I started sanding. Back and forth, back and forth. The repetitive motion was meditative. I wasn't managing anyone. I wasn't balancing a budget. I wasn't building a legacy. I was just making a piece of wood smooth so a child I would never meet could sleep in a proper bed without getting a splinter. And with every stroke of the sandpaper, I felt like I was smoothing out a rough edge inside myself. I kept going back. I learned to use a drill, a jigsaw, a planer. I learned the satisfaction of driving a screw in perfectly straight, of fitting two pieces of wood together into a seamless joint. My hands, which had grown soft from years of keyboard work, became calloused and strong. I was building things again. Not for profit, not for a legacy, but for a simple, immediate purpose. For a family that needed a table. For a child that needed a bed. I haven't seen Robert or Leo. I cashed their check and used it to secure my new life, a life they have no part in. I hear things sometimes, through the grapevine. The corporation that bought the company moved all the manufacturing overseas. All the local employees we had known for years were let go. The workshop, the place where our dream was born, sits empty now, a for sale sign on its lawn. In their pursuit of a smart business decision, they destroyed the very heart of what they had built. There is still a deep well of sadness in me. A betrayal like that leaves scars that never fully fade. I still miss the man I thought I married, and I mourn the son I thought I raised. But the pain is different now. It's no longer a roaring fire that consumes me. It's the quiet, deep ache of an old wound. It's a part of my story, but it is no longer the whole story. My life is small now, and it is quiet. But it is mine. It is authentically, completely mine. My apartment is filled with books, plants, and a few pieces of simple, imperfect furniture I have built with my own two hands. I have friends from the community center. We drink coffee, we share stories, we build things together. I have found that my purpose wasn't in a title or an ownership stake. It was in the act of creating, of caring, of contributing in some small way. Sometimes, late at night, I take out the note from my wallet. My partner in everything. I used to read those words and feel the sting of betrayal. But now I see them differently. He was wrong. I was never just his partner. I was always whole, all on my own. I just needed to lose everything to finally find myself. And this self, this quiet, calloused-handed woman who finds joy in the scent of sawdust and the gift of a simple, well-made chair, she is not for sale. Had you ever discovered that the quiet you fought so hard to find could be more fragile than glass? For months, silence had been my sanctuary. It was the balm on the wound of betrayal, the clean, empty space where I could begin to rebuild myself. But silence, I learned, is a promise that the world can't always keep. It can be shattered in an instant, not by a loud noise, but by a sound you thought you'd never hear again. For me, it was the specific, jarring ringtone I had once assigned to my son, Leo. A sound that hadn't broken the quiet of my new life in almost a year. When my phone buzzed on the small table beside me, that forgotten melody felt like a trespasser, a ghost from a past I had buried. I stared at his name on the screen, and my heart began to hammer against my ribs. I had learned to live without them. I had started to heal. But in that moment, I realized with a dreadful certainty that while I may have been finished with my past was not yet finished with me. That first year on my own was a slow, painful rebirth. The little apartment that had initially felt like a stark, empty box had gradually become a home. My home. I filled it not with expensive things, but with life. I bought plants and learned, through much trial and error, how to keep them alive. Their stubborn, silent growth was a daily lesson in resilience. My days found a new rhythm, one that wasn't dictated by purchase orders or client meetings. It was marked by the walk to the community center, the feel of a tool in my hand, and the easy, undemanding companionship of my fellow volunteers. Arthur, the gruff but gentle man who ran the workshop, had become a quiet friend. We rarely spoke of our pasts. Instead, we communicated through the shared language of work, a nod of approval at a well-made joint, a shared sigh of frustration over a warped piece of lumber. In that workshop, I wasn't Robert's wife or Leo's mother. I was just Beatrice, the woman who was surprisingly good at upholstery, the one who could calm the most temperamental sanding machine. I was building a new reputation, one that had nothing to do with balancing ledgers or making men feel important. It was based on the skill of my own two hands. My calluses were like medals, proof of a strength I never knew I possessed. I had built a life for myself that was small, yes, but it was sturdy. It was real, and I was fiercely protective of it. So when Leo's name flashed on my phone, my first instinct was to ignore it, to let the call go to the silence where it belonged. What could he possibly want? An olive branch? An apology? After a year of absolute, deafening silence, it felt too little, too late. But a deeper, more complicated feeling stirred in me. The stubborn, foolish love of a mother, a thread that even the sharpest betrayal couldn't completely sever. Cursing myself for my weakness, I answered, "Hello." My voice was rusty, cautious. "Mom?" His voice was different. The cool, corporate confidence was gone. He sounded tired, thinner. "Mom, are you there?" "I'm here, Leo." There was a long pause. I could hear him take a shaky breath. I need to see you. Can I come over? Please. The please was what did it. It was the word of a boy, not the command of a man who had coolly informed me that I was being dramatic. Against my better judgment, I gave him my address. An hour later, there was a hesitant knock on my door. I opened it to a stranger who looked hauntingly like my son. He was gaunt, with dark circles under his eyes. The expensive suit he wore hung off his frame, looking more like a costume than a symbol of success. He was holding a pot of wilting orchids, a pathetic, store-bought gesture that was so unlike the vibrant flowers from my old garden. He stepped inside, his eyes darting around my small living room. He seemed unsure of what to do, how to act. He finally set the orchids down on my coffee table, right next to a stack of library books. "It's nice," he said, the words sounding hollow. "It's small," I replied, not wanting his pity or his approval. "What do you want, Leo?" He sank onto my sofa, a piece I had reupholstered myself in a cheerful blue fabric. He ran his hands through his hair, a gesture of anxiety I recognized from his childhood. "It's all a mess, Mom," he said, his voice cracking. "Everything." I waited, my arms crossed over my chest, refusing to make it easy for him. "The company, the one that bought us out, they ran it into the ground. They promised all this synergy, all this growth. It was all lies. They stripped the assets, fired everyone, and declared bankruptcy a few months ago. The big payout we got, most of it was in stock options. It's worthless now. All of it." A cold, grim satisfaction flickered within me, and I was immediately ashamed of it. I had never wished for their failure. But hearing that the legacy they had stolen from me had turned to dust in their hands felt like a bitter kind of justice. "So the money's gone," I said, my voice flat. He nodded, not meeting my eyes. "Most of it. Dad isn't taking it well. He put everything into that. He trusted them." "He trusted them," I repeated, the irony thick in my throat. "And I trusted him." Leo finally looked at me, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of genuine remorse in his eyes. "I know," he whispered. "Mom, I am so sorry. I was an idiot. I was arrogant. I had all these ideas, these big-shot MBA theories. I saw you as an obstacle, as this sentimental part of the business that was holding us back from the big time." He shook his head, a look of self-loathing on his face. "The big time was a mirage. We sold a real, living thing for a pile of worthless paper. We destroyed everything." He looked around my apartment again, but this time with a different expression. Not judgment, but a kind of dawning understanding. "You built this," he said quietly. "You started over. With nothing." "I had my hands," I said. "And my self-respect. It turns out that's more than enough." He stood up, pacing the small room. "Dad, he's not well. He just sits in that big, empty house. The one the bank is going to take soon. He doesn't talk. He just stares. He looks 100 years old. He blames me. He blames himself. He's a broken man, Mom." He stopped in front of me, his eyes pleading. "He needs you." The words hit me like a physical blow. "He needs you." For 25 years, those words had been the engine of my life. Robert needs me to handle the books. Leo needs me to pack his lunch. The company needs me to soothe an angry client. I had answered that call every single time, but I had retired from that job. I had been fired, in fact. "No, Leo," I said, my voice shaking but firm. "He doesn't need me. He needed a partner, and he sold her down the river. He needed a wife, and he treated her like an employee. What he needs now is a lawyer and a doctor, and from what you're telling me, he has neither. That is not my problem to solve." The cruelty in my own words surprised me, but they were born of a deep, primal need for self-preservation. To let them back in, to take on their problems as my own again, would be to unravel everything I had so painstakingly stitched back together. It would be a suicide of the soul. "I can't help you," I said, walking to the door and opening it. "I'm sorry for what's happened to you. Truly. But my life is here now, and you are not a part of it." He looked at me, his face pale with shock and hurt. He had come here expecting the endless, forgiving well of a mother's love, and he had found it had finally run dry. He walked out without another word, leaving the wilting orchids on my table like a sad, forgotten apology. I closed the door, leaned my forehead against the cool wood, and for the first time in a year, I felt the familiar, agonizing pull of a life I thought I had escaped. The quiet in my apartment was no longer peaceful. It was heavy with choices I did not want to make. Leo's visit left a crack in the foundation of my new life. I tried to ignore it. I went to the workshop the next day, hoping the familiar scent of wood and the rhythm of the work would restore my peace. But my hands felt clumsy. My focus was gone. I kept seeing Robert's face as Leo had described it, a broken man in a big, empty house. I saw the arrogant boy I had sent away, his face etched with a desperation I had never seen before. Arthur must have noticed my distraction. He came over while I was fumbling with a piece of pine, my mind a million miles away. "You're going to take a finger off if you're not careful, Beatrice," he said, his voice gentle. He took the tool from my hand. Coffee break. We sat on a bench outside, nursing steaming mugs of cheap, strong coffee. He didn't press, just sat with me in the comfortable silence I had come to value. "My son came to see me yesterday," I finally said, the words spilling out. For the first time in a year. Arthur just nodded, his gaze fixed on a sparrow hopping on the pavement. "They lost everything," I continued. "The company they sold me out for, it was a sham. The money is gone. My husband, his health is failing. My son wants me to fix it, to come back and pick up the pieces." "And what do you want to do?" Arthur asked simply. The question floored me. For so long, my life had been about what others needed from me. What Robert needed. What Leo needed. The concept of what I wanted was still new, a muscle I was just learning to flex. "I want to be left alone," I said, the words fierce. "I want to keep this quiet, this little life I've made. It's not much, but it's mine. They have no right to come back and trample all over it." "No, they don't," he agreed. He took a sip of his coffee. "My wife, Eleanor, she passed away 5 years ago. Cancer. For the last 6 months of her life, I was her caretaker. I fed her, bathed her, read to her. It was the hardest thing I've ever done. And there were days I was so tired, so angry at the world, that I wished it would just be over. The moment I had that thought, I would hate myself for it." He looked at me, his eyes full of a deep, weary wisdom. "Feelings aren't simple, Beatrice. You can be angry at someone and still care about what happens to them. You can want to protect yourself and still feel the pull of your past. The heart's a messy place. It doesn't do clean breaks." His words didn't offer a solution, but they offered something more valuable: permission. Permission to feel all the contradictory things I was feeling. The anger and the pity. The desire for revenge and the pang of compassion. The love and the hate. I wasn't a bad person for wanting to turn my back on them. And I wasn't a weak person if some part of me still cared. 2 days later, the choice was taken out of my hands. The phone rang again. This time it wasn't Leo's ringtone. It was an unknown number. A brisk, professional voice on the other end informed me that she was a nurse from the local hospital. Mr. Robert Young had been admitted. He'd had a massive stroke. He was in critical condition. They had found my number listed under an old emergency contact file. Leo was unreachable. Was I his wife? Could I come? The world tilted on its axis. Stroke. Critical condition. These were words from another world, a world of sirens and beeping machines. I felt a strange, cold detachment, as if I were floating above my own body. "Yes," I heard myself say. "I'll be there." I walked to the hospital. I didn't take a taxi or a bus. I needed the 20-minute walk to try and process what was happening. The bright autumn air felt surreal against the backdrop of crisis. I wasn't his wife. Not anymore. I had no legal or moral obligation to go. I could turn around, go back to my apartment, and pretend the call never happened. But my feet kept moving forward, one in front of the other, carrying me towards the man who had shattered my life. Arthur's words echoed in my head. The heart's a messy place. The hospital was a sterile maze of pale green walls and the pervasive smell of disinfectant. I found the intensive care unit and gave my name. A doctor, a young woman with tired eyes, pulled me aside. The stroke was severe. It had affected his left side and his ability to speak. The prognosis was uncertain. They were doing everything they could. She led me to his room. And there he was. The man who had been my partner, my adversary, my ghost. He looked so small in the hospital bed, swallowed by a tangle of wires and tubes. His face, which I had last seen set in a mask of dismissive confidence, was slack and pale. One side of his mouth drooped. His eyes were closed. The hand that had so casually signed away my life lay limp and powerless on the white sheet. All the anger, all the bitterness I had been nursing for a year, evaporated in an instant. It was replaced by a wave of profound, aching sorrow. This wasn't the powerful man who had betrayed me. This was just a man. A fragile, frightened, broken man. I saw the faint scar above his eyebrow from when he'd fallen off a ladder in our first year of business. I saw the way his hair, now thin and gray, still curled at the nape of his neck. I saw 30 years of shared history lying helpless in a hospital bed. I pulled a chair to his bedside and, without thinking, I reached out and took his hand. It was cold. I just sat there, holding his hand, the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor the only sound in the room. A few hours later, Leo burst in, his face a mess of tears and panic. He stopped short when he saw me. "Mom," he breathed, a look of immense relief washing over him. "You came." "They called me," I said simply, not letting go of his father's hand. We sat in a strange, unspoken truce for the rest of the day and into the night. We were no longer mother and son, betrayer and betrayed. We were just two people watching a man we both, in our own complicated ways, loved. The barriers of anger and resentment were too heavy to maintain in the face of such stark, clinical reality. A few days later, Robert regained a fragile consciousness. The stroke had stolen his words. He could make sounds, frustrated grunts, but he couldn't form a sentence. The artist who could make would sing was now silenced. His eyes, however, were lucid, and they were filled with a terrifying, bottomless fear. When he looked at me, I saw no pride, no condescension. I only saw regret. One afternoon, when Leo was down in the cafeteria, I was alone with Robert. I was wetting a cloth to soothe his dry lips. He struggled to lift his good hand, his right hand, and fumbled for a pen and a pad of paper on the nightstand. His movements were clumsy, infuriatingly slow. He managed to scrawl a single word, the letters shaky and almost illegible. I leaned in to read it. It said, "Scared." I looked at him, and his eyes were swimming with tears. He tapped the word with his finger, then looked at me, a desperate, pleading expression on his face. And in that moment, I understood. It wasn't about greed, not entirely. It wasn't just about arrogance. It was about fear. The fear of getting old. The fear of being a failure. The fear of the business he'd built with his hands becoming obsolete. The big, flashy sale to the corporation wasn't a victory lap. It was a desperate, foolish attempt to outrun his own mortality. He had grabbed for a golden parachute and found it was made of smoke. I took the pen from his hand, and on the pad, below his word, I wrote one of my own. Me too. His tears finally fell, rolling down his temples into his gray hair. I wiped them away with the cloth. It wasn't forgiveness. It was something quieter and perhaps more profound. It was recognition. I recognized his brokenness because I had lived my own. I recognized his fear because I had been consumed by it. In the weeks that followed, I became the coordinator. I spoke with the doctors. I navigated the labyrinth of hospital bureaucracy. I talked to the social workers about long-term care. Leo, lost and overwhelmed, was grateful to hand over the reins. He followed my lead like a child. I was efficient. I was capable. I was falling back into my old role. But this time, it felt different. I wasn't doing it out of a wife's duty or a mother's obligation. I was doing it because I was the only one who could. I was doing it from a place of strength, not servitude. When Robert was finally stable enough to be moved to a long-term care facility, I handled the arrangements. I packed a small bag for him from the house, a house I never stepped foot in again. I asked Leo to bring me a few specific things. His favorite old flannel shirt, a photograph of the two of us from before the business ever started, and the small, hand-carved bird he had made for me on our 5th wedding anniversary. The day he was transferred, I stood by his gurney as the paramedics prepared to move him. He reached for my hand, his grip surprisingly strong. He looked at me, his eyes conveying a universe of things he could no longer say. "Thank you. I'm sorry. Don't leave." I squeezed his hand. "I will visit, Robert," I said, my voice soft but clear. "I will make sure you are taken care of. But my life is not here. My life is my own now." I let go of his hand. I turned to Leo. "He's your father. He will need you." Then I walked out. I walked out of the hospital, into the crisp afternoon air, and I did not look back. I had faced the ghosts of my past. I had looked them in the eye, tended to their wounds, and acknowledged their humanity. But I had not let them pull me back into the grave of my old life. I had walked through the fire of my greatest heartbreak and emerged, not unscathed, but whole. I was on my way back to my small apartment, to my quiet, to my own two hands, and the work that awaited them. And for the first time, I knew with absolute certainty that no matter what came next, I would be all right. The walk home from the hospital was the longest and shortest of my life. Each step on the familiar pavement felt both heavy with the weight of the past and light with the possibility of a future I had chosen for myself. The air was turning colder, carrying the earthy scent of approaching winter, a smell that had always felt like an ending. But for me, it felt like a clarification. I had walked into that sterile building as a woman haunted by ghosts, and I was walking away as a woman who had learned to live alongside them. I had not vanquished them, but I had taken away their power. They were a part of my story, a chapter one could now turn without tearing the page. My new life settled into a rhythm that was both peaceful and profound. 2 or 3 times a week, I would take the bus to the long-term care facility where Robert now lived. The facility was clean and quiet, but it hummed with an undercurrent of sorrow and forgotten stories. I would sit with him in the sterile common room or by the window in his small, neat room. Our visits were silent affairs. I would read to him, sometimes from a novel, sometimes from the local newspaper, my voice a steady presence in the quiet of his new reality. I would help him with his lunch, cutting his food into small pieces, holding the cup to his lips. These were the intimate acts of a caretaker, not a wife. He could not speak, but his eyes followed my every move. In them, I saw a storm of emotions I could only guess at: frustration, shame, a desperate, clawing regret. He would sometimes grip my hand, his knuckles white, and a low, guttural sound of anguish would escape his throat. In those moments, I would not offer false comfort or easy platitudes. I would simply meet his gaze and hold his hand until the storm passed. This was not forgiveness. Forgiveness felt like too simple a word for the tangled wreckage of our shared history. It was, I suppose, an act of bearing witness. I was witnessing the consequences of his choices, and in doing so, I was releasing myself from the burden of my anger. I was choosing compassion over bitterness, not for his sake, but for my own. Bitterness is a heavy stone to carry, and I was tired of being weighed down. Leo was a constant presence at the facility. He was devoted, spending hours by his father's side, trying to coax a response, to bridge the silent chasm that now separated them. He had taken a menial job at a hardware store to make ends meet, the crisp suits and confident swagger replaced by a stained apron and a perpetual look of exhaustion. When our paths crossed in the hallway, our conversations were stilted and awkward. He would thank me for coming, his eyes full of a gratitude that I found difficult to accept. He was a son grieving for a father who was both there and not there, and he was a man paying the price for his own youthful hubris. My true life, my real life, remained at the workshop. It was my anchor and my harbor. The scent of pine and the camaraderie of shared work were the constants I could rely on. I had graduated from sanding and simple assembly. Arthur, seeing a quiet determination in me, had started teaching me the finer points of joinery, how to cut a dovetailed joint that fit so perfectly it seemed to be grown from a single piece of wood. My hands, once soft and manicured for office work, were now strong and capable, mapped with the fine lines of tiny scars and calluses. I cherished them. They were the hands of a creator, a builder. One raw afternoon in late autumn, as I was carefully measuring a cut for a bookcase, the door to the workshop creaked open and Leo stood there. He looked terribly out of place, a ship washed up on a foreign shore. The other volunteers glanced at him, then politely looked away, sensing the private nature of his arrival. "Mom," he said, his voice low. "Can I talk to you?" I put down my ruler, wiped the sawdust from my hands onto my jeans, and walked over to him. "What is it, Leo? Is it your father?" "No, he's the same," he said, shaking his head. He gestured vaguely at the bustling workshop around him. This is where you work?" "I volunteer," I corrected him gently. "It's where I spend my days." He looked at the half-finished projects, the stacks of lumber, the tools hanging in neat rows on the walls. He looked at me, in my dusty work clothes, and I saw a flicker of the boy he used to be, the one who would watch his father in the garage with wide, adoring eyes. "He used to love messes like this," he said, a sad smile touching his lips. We stood in silence for a moment. Then he took a deep breath. "I quit the hardware store," he said. I can't stand it. Stocking shelves, ringing up customers, after everything. I feel like I'm going crazy. I need to do something. Something real." He looked me straight in the eye, his own filled with a desperate plea. "I need to work with my hands. It's the only thing that ever made sense. Can I help here? I'll do anything. Sweep the floors. Anything." I looked at my son, truly looked at him. I saw the wreckage of his ambition, the shame of his failure. But I also saw a glimmer of something else, a desire to reconnect with the one true thing our family had ever created, which was the love of the craft itself. It wasn't about money or success anymore. It was about the work. Before I could answer, Arthur walked over, wiping his hands on a rag. He had the uncanny ability to sense the emotional temperature of a room. He looked from my face to Leo's. "Is this your boy, Beatrice?" he asked. I nodded. "This is my son, Leo." Arthur extended a calloused hand to him. "Arthur, pleased to meet you." Leo shook it, surprised by the gesture. "Your mother's one of our best," Arthur continued, his eyes twinkling. "Got a real feel for the wood. Runs in the family, I expect." He glanced at Leo's soft, unscarred hands. "You want to work? We can always use another pair of hands. The only payment is a good feeling and bad coffee." And just like that, Leo started volunteering. I kept my distance at first, watching him from across the workshop. I half expected him to last a day, to be put off by the menial tasks and the lack of prestige. But he stayed. He swept floors without complaint. He sorted screws and stacked lumber. He listened intently when one of the older volunteers showed him how to use a power sander. He was quiet, humble, and hardworking. He was earning his place, not with words or apologies, but with effort. A few weeks later, a new request came into the charity. A young family who had lost their home in a fire had finally been placed in a new, small apartment. They had nothing. They needed everything, but their most urgent request was for a kitchen table. A place to sit down together, the social worker had written on the request form. A place to feel like a family again. Arthur pinned the request to the board. "All right," he announced to the workshop. "We need a good, sturdy table. 6 feet long, solid pine. Who's up for it?" I felt a pull, a strange resonance with the request. A table. The heart of a home. The first thing Robert and I had ever built and sold. I stepped forward. "I'll lead this one," I said. Then, from the back of the room, Leo spoke up, his voice quiet but clear. "I'd like to help. If that's okay." All eyes turned to me. It was a test. A crossroad. I could have said no, kept him at arm's length, relegated him to standing chair legs. But I looked at his earnest, hopeful face, and I saw a chance. Not to rebuild what we had lost, because that was impossible, but to build something new. "Okay," I said. "We start tomorrow." Working together was a delicate dance of memory and silence. We didn't talk about the old company. We didn't talk about his father. We talked about the wood. We spoke of grain patterns and saw blades, of wood glue and curing times. I found myself teaching him, just as I had once taught him his multiplication tables. I showed him how to measure twice and cut once, a lesson that now had a painful, ironic weight. He was a natural, of course. His father's gift was in his hands, in his spatial awareness, in the innate understanding of how things fit together. As we worked side by side, the awkwardness began to melt away. We fell into the easy, silent rhythm of shared labor. I would hold a board steady while he made a cut. He would anticipate my need for a clamp or a certain drill bit. We were communicating without words, in the language of the workshop, the language of our family's past. One afternoon, as we were fitting the legs to the tabletop, he paused and looked at the strong, simple joint we had just created. "You were always the one who made things fit, Mom," he said softly, not looking at me. "The numbers, the schedules, the people. You made it all work. We were just the guys making noise in the workshop. We never understood that you were the one holding it all together." He finally turned to me, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "I am so sorry I didn't see that. I am so sorry for what we did to you." This time, the apology landed. It wasn't a desperate plea for help. It was a quiet statement of fact, a confession born from the clarity of his own failure and the humility of this new work. I put my hand on his arm. "I know, Leo," I said. "I know you are." We finished the table the following week. It was beautiful, not in a polished showroom way. It was simple, honest, and strong. You could feel the care that had gone into it. Arthur and the other volunteers gathered around, running their hands over the smooth, waxed surface, nodding their approval. That Saturday, I delivered the table myself. Leo offered to come, but I told him no. This was something I needed to do alone. The apartment was small, in a low-income housing block, but the young mother who answered the door had eyes full of hope. Her 2 small children peeked out from behind her legs. When they saw the table, their faces lit up. Arthur and I carried it in and set it in the center of their small kitchen. It filled the room. It grounded the space. The mother walked over and placed her hands flat on the surface, just as I had done 1,000 times on the tables Robert had built. "It's perfect," she whispered, tears in her eyes. "Oh, thank you. It's a start." A start. Yes, that's what it was. Driving away from that building, I felt a sense of peace that was deeper and more profound than anything I had ever known. My legacy wasn't a corporate brand name or a large bank account. It was this feeling. The quiet satisfaction of providing a small measure of comfort and stability to a stranger. It was the legacy of my own 2 hands, offered freely, without expectation of profit or praise. My life now is not the one I dreamed of as a young woman. It's a smaller, quieter, more weathered life. But it is a life of my own making. I still visit Robert. I still see Leo at the workshop, where he is slowly, patiently, building a new man from the wreckage of the old one. Our relationship is not what it was, and it never will be. It is something new, something more honest, forged in the fires of betrayal and loss. Sometimes, when the workshop is quiet, I take out the folded dollar bill from my wallet and look at the note tucked inside, "To my partner in everything." For the longest time, those words were a source of deep pain. But now I see them differently. My partner wasn't just one person. My partners are Arthur and the other volunteers, and the people we help. My partner is the stubborn, resilient woman who refused to be erased. My partner is myself. I finally learned how to be my own partner in everything. My name is Beatrice Young, and I am the architect of my own peace.